What if the quietest student in the room held the answer to a decades-old scientific mystery and no one saw it coming? The heavy oak doors of Lecture Hall B17 creaked open as the last few students slipped inside, their footsteps echoing against the polished tile. Winter sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long, cold shadows on the granite floor. At precisely 9 a.m., Dr. Vincent Mercer entered. His dark blazer was impeccably pressed, his silver hair combed with military precision, and his signature frown already in place. The students straightened instinctively, as if summoned to attention by a general. Dr. Mercer's reputation preceded him. He wasn't just a tenured professor at Halban University's prestigious physics department, he was the gatekeeper. He demanded absolute excellence, but not through encouragement or support. His classroom was an arena. His lectures were trials by fire. Those who didn't burn under pressure were either ignored or broken. Elena Marquez sat in the back, 3 rows from the top, her small figure nearly swallowed by the vastness of the auditorium. A worn grey cardigan draped over her shoulders, sleeves pulled slightly over her hands. Her black hair was neatly tucked behind one ear, and her eyes, sharp and quiet, followed Mercer's every move without flinching. She scribbled into a small notebook, her handwriting small, tight, meticulous. Mercer's voice boomed across the room. Today, we examine entanglement. I assume none of you have gotten distracted by your social media long enough to review the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Mercer's lips curled in disdain. And then, as if picking his target for the day, his eyes locked on Elena. You back row. Miss Marquez, is it? Dozens of heads turned. Elena didn't look up immediately. She finished writing her sentence, then calmly raised her gaze. Yes, Professor, she replied. You seem deeply engrossed in your own thoughts. Perhaps you'd like to enlighten the class. Tell us, how does Bell's theorem disprove the assumptions of locality proposed by the EPR paradox? A hush fell over the room. Even the sound of pens scribbling stopped. It wasn't a question. It was an ambush. Elena's heart beat evenly in her chest. She stood, her small frame dwarfed by the sweeping auditorium. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen believed quantum mechanics was incomplete, that particles held hidden variables, and that measuring one particle couldn't instantly affect another across space, she said, her voice soft but clear. She continued, Bell's theorem demonstrated otherwise. Through mathematical inequalities, Bell showed that if local hidden variables existed, certain statistical correlations wouldn't appear, but quantum entanglement produced results that violated those inequalities, meaning either the information is non-local or our understanding of realism is flawed. The words weren't rehearsed. They were lived, felt, understood, Doctor. Mercer's smirk wavered. Elena quoted an obscure passage from a physics digest he had referenced just once, over a month ago. Her tone didn't waver. She didn't perform. She revealed, and it stunned him. A few students exhaled quietly. One boy let out a stifled laugh. Doctor. Mercer's fingers tightened around a piece of chalk. Do you have a photographic memory, Miss Marquez? He asked, his voice clipped. No, she replied, her eyes calm. Just an excellent one. The room shifted. The power dynamic tilted. Dr. Mercer didn't reply. He looked down at his notes, something he rarely did, and continued the lecture, though with noticeably less fire. After class, the whispers began. Did you see what she did? She made Mercer pause. Who even is she? Eleanor collected her things slowly, methodically. As she zipped her backpack, she heard one girl whisper, "She's not from here, right? Maybe Singapore or something?" "Eleanor Marquez," she corrected gently, without looking up. "From New Jersey?" The girl blushed and turned away. Outside, the campus wind bit at her cheeks as she pulled her scarf tighter. She didn't mind the cold. It was quieter than heat. More honest. She passed the library where she worked part-time, tucked behind the science archives. Books had always made more sense than people. Pages didn't stare. Ink didn't make assumptions about your skin, your voice, or the name your mother whispered to you when you were sick. At the edge of campus, she paused by the memorial fountain. Her reflection stared back steady, reserved, unremarkable, but inside her, the moment still echoed. Her grandfather's words returned to her like a whispered chess move. "You don't need to shout to win, mija. You only need to see the whole board." Eleanor walked on. What began as a routine humiliation by a man of unchecked authority had shifted. And though no one knew it yet, something larger had been set in motion, not by force, not by rebellion, but by truth, spoken clearly and without fear. And the next time, Dr. Vincent Mercer looked into that crowd of students, searching for weakness. He would remember the name Elena Marquez, because now the board was hers. Long before she ever stood up to Dr. Vincent Mercer, in front of 100 stunned students, Eleanor Marquez had already mastered the art of being quiet in a loud world. Back in Newark, New Jersey, where she grew up, there was no ivory tower, no elite lecture halls, just a cramped, two-bedroom apartment stacked above the old municipal library where her mother, Teresa Marquez, had worked as head librarian for nearly 2 decades. The floors creaked when you walked, and the scent of worn paper was as common as air. It was in that library where Eleanor learned to read not just books, but people, patterns, movements, silences. Where most kids had bedtime stories, Elena had footnotes. While her classmates memorized state capitals, she was mapping the stars in her grandfather Eduardo's old astronomy journal, a battered thing, covered in his scribbled Spanish notes and the occasional chess diagram. Her grandfather, whom everyone in the neighborhood called Don Lolo, had once been a chess champion in Manila. His hands were always clasped behind his back, his shirts always buttoned to the top. He spoke little, but when he did, the words hit like parables. He taught Elena that chess was not about aggression. It was about anticipation. "You don't play the move you want to play, Nena," he told her once, over a game they played in the half-dark kitchen. "You play the move your opponent hasn't prepared for." Those words stayed with her. At school, Eleanor kept to herself. She didn't raise her hand, didn't volunteer for debate club or science fairs, but she watched, she listened, and she learned faster than anyone else. By the time she turned 13, her mother discovered her in the storage closet of the library, reading graduate-level physics papers downloaded and printed from online forums. She'd made notes in the margins, small, clear handwriting, color-coded. When Teresa asked her why she didn't ask for help, Elena had simply said, "No one listens when I speak, but they can't ignore what I write." Teresa didn't argue. She just made her daughter hot cocoa and sat beside her on the floor, quietly proud and quietly worried. Because brilliance in the wrong place often draws the wrong kind of attention. As the years passed, Elena's academic abilities began to outgrow the resources around her. Public school teachers were impressed, but overwhelmed counselors tried to encourage her to slow down and enjoy being a kid. But how could she slow down when her mind refused to? At age 16, she applied secretly to an interdisciplinary science initiative funded by MIT for underrepresented prodigies. When she got the acceptance letter, she didn't scream, she didn't even smile. She just quietly placed it on the table in front of her mother and grandfather and said, "I think I found my place." It wasn't MIT that came first, though. Halban University, an Ivy League-level institution in upstate New York, had accepted her as a pilot student into a parallel research exchange. She would study there first, in relative anonymity, and if she succeeded, MIT would be waiting. The plan was perfect, almost too perfect, but Halban wasn't like her library back home. It wasn't warm, it wasn't safe, it was cold. Stone corridors and polished marble stairs. Students there didn't whisper because they were shy. They whispered because they judged. And Dr. Vincent Mercer was the worst of them. He didn't see her as brilliant. He didn't see her at all, until she answered his question. After that, things began to change. Slowly, quietly, but irrevocably. In the dorm, whispers followed her now. "Who is she?" She quoted Bell from memory. Mercer didn't even argue back. She'd become visible, but visibility was dangerous. Eleanor knew that the moment she stepped into Halban's student commons the next day, a few students, clearly legacy admissions, stared at her as if she were a fraud. One of them, Avery Chen, the daughter of a wealthy donor loft behind her back, and called her the library ghost. Eleanor didn't respond. She just made a note of the name, not out of spite. Out of pattern recognition, chess, after all, was still being played. That night, she called her mom. "I didn't mean to embarrass him," Eleanor said, curled up by the window as snow fell lightly against the pane. Teresa was quiet on the other end for a moment, before replying, "You didn't embarrass him, Mija. You exposed him, and men like him, they don't like being seen for who they truly are." Eleanor looked out at the snow-covered lawn. She whispered, "What if they try to get rid of me?" Her mother's voice softened. "Then you let them try. But don't you ever shrink again just because someone else doesn't know how to grow." That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal, not an assignment, not research notes, just thoughts. "I was never trying to win. I just wanted to be honest. I just wanted to breathe." She closed the journal, laid it beside her pillow, and for the first time since arriving at Halban, fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She didn't know what the next week would bring, but she knew this Dr. Mercer had underestimated her. So had the university, so had nearly everyone in that room. But her grandfather never had. Play the move they're not ready for, and Eleanor Marquez was just getting started. The Monday after the incident was unusually warm for early spring. Yet inside Lecture Hall 3C, the air was brittle, tense, like glass waiting to shatter. Elena Marquez entered the room with her usual quiet grace, her books pressed tightly to her chest, her cardigan sleeves pulled down to her knuckles. She slipped into the same seat as always, back row, center, where the entire lecture space opened up before her like a chessboard. The murmurs started before she even sat down. "That's the girl. Didn't you hear?" She dismantled Mercer like he was a substitute. "She's dangerous." Eleanor didn't react. She had no interest in the myth they were creating. She only cared about the truth, about what came next. Dr. Vincent Mercer entered 5 minutes late. For him, that was unheard of. Usually he arrived early, already writing on the board, basking in the uneasy hush that settled before his lectures. Today, however, he looked shaken, his tie slightly crooked, his briefcase unzipped. He didn't look at the students, didn't even acknowledge Elena. He just began the lesson, his voice a little too loud, as if trying to prove control through volume. Today, he announced, we'll be examining quantum field fluctuations within the Casimir effect. Most students blinked. Elena raised an eyebrow. She had studied the Casimir effect in high school, not formally, of course, just in passing, through a YouTube channel run by retired physicists, but she'd gone deeper. Much deeper. She knew what Mercer was doing. He was laying a trap, a complex topic. Sparse literature, a subtle dig at her last performance. He wanted to push her into silence again. Reclaim his ground. She waited. Quiet, patient. And then it came. "Miss Marquez," Mercer said, turning from the whiteboard without warning, "since you seem to enjoy leading the conversation, perhaps you could explain what implications the Casimir vacuum state might have on zero-point energy models." The room fell into a hush. Another trap, another test. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She calmly uncapped her pen and replied, "The Casimir vacuum, as defined between two uncharged plates in a vacuum, shows that the quantum field has fluctuations even in a zero-energy state. The negative pressure between plates confirms the existence of zero-point energy not as theoretical noise, but as measurable force." A pause. Mercer blinked. "However," she added, "your question assumes that Casimir geometry is the only viable indicator. Recent work by Dr. Jaffe and colleagues suggests that it can be explained without invoking zero-point fluctuations at all. So, perhaps the real implication is that we don't fully understand the boundaries of our own definitions yet." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't shock, it was awe. Elena had not only answered, she had elevated the conversation. A ripple of whispers surged through the hall, and for the first time, Mercer looked cornered. The class ended 20 minutes later, with no further remarks from him. He collected his notes in silence, avoiding her gaze entirely. As students filed out, a voice behind Elena whispered, "I hope you know what you're doing." She turned. It was Jamie Linwooder, third-year theoretical math major. She'd seen him before. Sharp, ambitious, smug. "I beg your pardon," she said. "You embarrassed Mercer. Twice. That doesn't just go away. He's tenured, protected." "You're not," Jamie said. "This place, Halburn, doesn't like to be challenged from the bottom." "I didn't challenge Halburn," she replied evenly. "I challenged a flawed question." Jamie smirked. "Same thing." He walked off before she could respond, leaving his words like frost in the air. That afternoon, Elena was summoned to Dean Harold Montgomery's office. Again. This time, there were two other people waiting inside. Dr. Lorraine Adler, chair of physics, and a woman in a navy blazer whose nameplate simply read Academic Integrity Board. Teresa Marquez had once told her, "When powerful people can't discredit your ideas, they try to discredit your origins." Now, that prophecy had arrived. Dean Montgomery gestured toward the seat. Eleanor sat. "Miss Marquez," he began, hands folded, "there's been interest in the sudden nature of your academic ascent here." "I see," Elena said quietly. Dr. Adler leaned forward. "Your answers to Dr. Mercer's questions were exceptional. Exceptional enough that we're now conducting a routine review of your transfer application and background credentials. It's not a reflection of wrongdoing, just policy." "Policy?" Eleanor repeated, her tone neutral. "Is there suspicion of plagiarism?" No, Montgomery interjected quickly. Nothing like that. It's simply unusual. Your previous academic records don't match the level of performance we've witnessed. You mean they don't match what you expected? She said. A beat. The woman from the integrity board scribbled something. Dean Montgomery cleared his throat. In the meantime, we're requesting that you refrain from open debates in lectures until the review is complete. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Let me be clear, she said. I answered a question I was directly asked. Publicly with respect, my performance is being challenged not because it was dishonest, but because it was too good. Another beat. The room bristled. I understand, she added finally. I'll wait for your review. She stood and left, head held high. That evening, Eleanor didn't call her mother. Instead, she returned to her dorm and pulled out her chessboard. She played both sides. White-black. Queen-bishop. Sacrifice recovery. She was deep in a mid-game when a knock came at the door. It was Dr. Lorraine Adler. May I? She asked. Elena nodded cautiously. I shouldn't be here, Adler began, but I wanted to say that what you did, it mattered, and not just to us. There's a visitor coming next week from MIT. She read about the Mercer exchange. She's asked to meet you. Elena blinked. Why? She whispered. Because, Adler said, stepping back into the hall, you just proved you're playing at a different level. The door closed softly. Elena stared at the chessboard, then moved her queen forward with calm certainty. The game had begun. The days that followed moved like fog across Campus Slow, heavy and unspoken. Elena Marquez kept her head down, not from fear, not from guilt, but from precision. Every step she took, every lecture she attended, was carefully calculated, like a pawn moving through enemy territory. Rumors still trailed behind her like shadows. Some students nodded to her with admiration. Others kept their distance. The faculty? They had grown quiet. Even Dr. Mercer hadn't called on her again. But Elena knew silence was rarely neutral. It was preparation. On a quiet Wednesday morning, as mist clung to the edges of Halban's Gothic rooftops, Dean Harold Montgomery's assistant called her in for a scheduled informational meeting. Elena arrived at the administration building 5 minutes early. Always early. She hated surprises, but the woman waiting for her inside wasn't from the dean's office. She was from MIT. Dr. Lorraine Adler stood at the window, arms crossed, her posture both relaxed and utterly controlled. She looked to be in her mid-50s, with silver streaks woven through her dark hair like lightning in a midnight sky. She turned as Eleanor entered. "You're Eleanor," she said, not a question, a confirmation. "Come in." Eleanor hesitated only slightly before stepping forward. "Dr." Kohler extended a hand. "I've been watching you, not in a strange way," she added quickly, a rare smile touching her lips, "but in the way mentors do when they've been looking for a spark in a system that's gone dim." Eleanor sat, unsure what to say. "Doctor." Kohler didn't waste time. "Do you know how many girls who look like you make it into theoretical physics at the graduate level?" she asked softly. "Not many, and even fewer who challenge the status quo without backing down." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the fabric of her skirt. "I didn't challenge anything. I answered a question." Kohler tilted her head. "Exactly." A pause. Then Kohler continued, "What you did to Mercer, that wasn't just courage. That was brilliance. And it wasn't just about the quantum mechanics, Elena. It was about what you represented in that room. You weren't just answering him. You were dismantling an entire culture of fear. Elena looked away. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to feel proud. She didn't. She felt exposed. Like a light had been shined on something she'd kept in the dark for so long. Kola softened her tone. I was once you. A girl in a lecture hall where everyone looked right through me. I spent years making myself invisible, waiting for permission to speak, but no one ever gave it. Eventually, I realized, you just have to take it. Silence. Then Eleanor whispered, Why are you here? Kola pulled a file from her bag and slid it across the desk. It had Elena's name on it. I run an independent research cohort for emerging thinkers, Kola said, MIT sponsored quietly. It's not about grades or legacy names, it's about brilliance that doesn't fit inside the box. We've been following your transcripts, your transfer essays, your published response to Mercer's flawed theory, which, by the way, made it into a peer-reviewed faculty newsletter. Eleanor blinked. She hadn't known that. Come work with me, Kola said plainly. Finish the semester here, but after that join the cohort. We'll build something from the ground up. You'll have space. Resources people who get it. The offer hung in the air like oxygen, and for the first time in weeks, Elena felt like she could breathe. Later that evening, she sat alone in the library's north wing, her sanctuary. Rain whispered against the arched windows. Her journal lay open before her. She didn't write equations. She wrote thoughts. Who am I if I accept? Who will I become if I don't? Across from her, between shelves of books forgotten by time, she spotted a familiar figure, Dr. Lorraine Adler, the chair of the physics department. The one who had warned her, quietly, behind closed doors. Adler approached slowly. I heard Kola visited today. Eleanor nodded. She made you the offer? Another nod. Dr. Adler sat beside her, folding her hands in her lap. She's not wrong. You don't belong here. Eleanor flinched, but Adler smiled gently. I mean that in the best way. You belong somewhere that won't be threatened by you. Where people won't try to dim your light just because they can't match it. For a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't being foolish. I always thought being invisible would protect me, she whispered. But maybe I was just waiting to be found. Adler nodded. You weren't waiting. You were preparing. The next day, Dr. Mercer stood at the front of Lecture Hall 3C, business as usual, but his voice lacked the sharpness it once carried. His eyes no longer scanned the room like a predator. Elena watched him from her usual seat. When he finally looked her way, their eyes met, but only for a second. And in that second, something passed between them. Not anger, not fear, but quiet acknowledgement. He knew he had lost, and she had only just begun. By the time spring whispered through the bare branches of Halban's courtyard, change had already seeped into the cracks of the university's worn stone walls. But for Eleanor Marquez, change wasn't something you welcomed. It was something you prepared for. The air around campus buzzed with unspoken rumors. Students whispered about a transfer girl who had taken down Dr. Mercer in a lecture hall showdown. The story grew in layers. Some said she quoted Bell's theorem like poetry. Others swore she humiliated Mercer so badly he cut lectures short for the first time in years. Eleanor tried to ignore it, but fame, even the quiet kind, had a way of reshaping a person's world. She wasn't invisible anymore. And for someone like Dr. Vincent Mercer, that made her dangerous. It began with a letter. Tucked into her mailbox in the physics building, folded with surgical precision and bearing no return address. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. Her name was printed in block letters across the front. Inside, a single sentence. "We're watching your trajectory with interest. Consider this your preliminary invitation. No logo. No signature. Just coordinates longitude and latitude beneath the final line." She typed them into her laptop. They led to a remote research facility, barely a blip on the digital map, funded by a private branch of MIT's Theoretical Science Division. Dr. Kohler's world, she understood immediately, this wasn't just about academics anymore. This was an entrance exam, and someone was watching how she would play the next move. 2 days later, an official invitation arrived in Elena's email. Halban was hosting a campus-wide academic symposium, students, faculty, visiting researchers. Every year, Mercer used the event as his platform to flex intellectual dominance. Eleanor hadn't planned to attend, until now. Her name was on the schedule. Listed next to Mercer's, a panel, not a lecture. Theoretical convergences, challenging foundations in quantum causality. Beneath it, her name, Elena Marquez, undergraduate guest speaker, and across from hers, Dr. Vincent Mercer, senior faculty moderator. She hadn't applied. She hadn't volunteered. Someone had signed her up. More precisely, someone had set her up. She stared at the screen for a long time. Her heart thudded like a metronome gone off tempo. Then she closed her laptop and smiled. They thought this would break me. They still don't understand. I was built for this. The night before the panel, Eleanor didn't study. She didn't rehearse. She wrote. In the quiet solitude of her dorm, she opened her journal and wrote a letter, not to anyone in particular, but to the version of herself who once sat in the back of lecture halls, hoping not to be noticed. You don't have to hide anymore. You don't need their permission to speak. You are not here to survive. You are here to shift the ground beneath their feet. She closed the journal, pressed her palms together, and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, the game would change again, and she wouldn't be playing defense. The auditorium was filled beyond capacity. Students lined the walls. Reporters sat near the front. Eleanor entered from the side door, a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled into a neat twist. No makeup, no flash, just precision, Doctor. Mercer stood at the podium, mid-introduction, his voice as oily as ever. And joining us today, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, is Miss Elena Marquez, a student whose enthusiasm for theoretical physics has certainly made waves this semester. There was a polite ripple of laughter. Eleanor walked calmly to the lectern. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she placed a small stack of note cards down, opened her water bottle, and adjusted the microphone. Then she looked at the audience and smiled. Before I begin, she said, I'd like to thank Dr. Mercer for inviting me, though, to be honest. I didn't know I'd been invited until the schedule went live. That drew a few chuckles. Mercer's expression barely flickered. She continued, her voice steady. I've been asked to offer a rebuttal to Dr. Mercer's recent work on temporal causality and the rejection of retrocausation in quantum theory. She tapped the lectern. But I'm not going to do that. Gasps. Mercer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Instead, Eleanor continued, I'm going to challenge the structure of the argument itself, not the conclusions, but the questions, because when your foundation is biased, your answers will always lean in one direction. She turned toward the massive projection screen behind them. A slide appeared. A diagram of Mercer's model, annotated in red. And so began a 28-minute lecture that peeled back the layers of theoretical physics like a seasoned researcher. She referenced obscure journals, quoted long-forgotten dissenting physicists. And then, without fanfare, she presented an alternate model. One that didn't just challenge Mercer's assumptions, it replaced them. When she finished, the auditorium was silent. Then came the applause. Slow, hesitant, and then thunderous. Mercer didn't speak. Couldn't he offer a tight-lipped smile and motioned for the moderator to close the session? But Elena didn't move. She walked back to the mic one last time. "I came to Halban thinking I'd have to prove myself over and over," she said, her voice soft. "But it turns out, I just had to stop asking for permission." She stepped away, and this time, no one laughed. That night, Eleanor received another message. This one from Dr. Kohler. "Your invitation is no longer preliminary. Welcome to the program." She closed the email and stood at her window, watching the lights of Halban twinkle beneath the indigo sky. The university had tried to break her. But all it had done was reveal what she was made of. Not glass, not fear, but fire. The applause still echoed in Elena's ears long after she left the stage, but applause was fleeting. She knew that. What lingered longer, what dug deeper, was the silence that followed her footsteps down the long marble hallway. The kind of silence that didn't come from admiration, but from calculation. Because someone, somewhere, had decided she was now a threat. By the next morning, the tone had shifted. The Halban Chronicle ran a cautious headline. Undergrad challenges tenured authority in quantum showdown. Comments flooded the article. Some called her brilliant, brave, a rising star. But others were less kind. She embarrassed a respected professor for attention. No real academic should undermine a peer like that. She memorized a few books and got lucky. The whispers returned. Only now, they were sharper, meaner, delivered with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Eleanor, great presentation," one student said in the corridor. "But don't you think it was a bit much?" "A little aggressive," another added. "You know how these things work. You don't challenge someone like Dr. Mercer on stage unless you're asking for trouble." She said nothing, just nodded politely and kept walking. They weren't worried about Mercer's reputation, they were warning her. Stay in your lane. 3 days later, the dean summoned her, not with a letter, not an email. A knock on her dorm door at 7:15 a.m. She opened it, wearing sweats and a loose hoodie, her hair in a bun. The administrative assistant gave a tight smile and handed her a printed memo. Mandatory meeting, 9 a.m. Office of Academic Standards. Subject, ethical inquiry. She stared at it for a full minute. They had made their move. The meeting room was cold, sterile, lined with files and thick drapes that swallowed sound. Across the table sat 3 faculty members and 1 university lawyer. The chair cleared her throat. "Miss Marquez, this is not a disciplinary hearing," she began. "This is a preliminary inquiry into concerns raised regarding your recent presentation and academic conduct." Eleanor sat straight, calm. "What concerns?" The woman shifted uncomfortably. "Dr. Mercer has questioned the originality of your work. Specifically, he claims portions of your alternative model resemble unpublished research from within his department. Eleanor blinked slowly. The accusation wasn't surprising, but it still stung. I developed the model independently. My notes, my sources, my simulations, they're all time-stamped. I can provide documentation. We'd appreciate that, the lawyer said, his tone neutral but clipped. It wasn't about facts. Not really. It was about discrediting her. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by printed files, dated notebooks, and USB drives, every step of her work meticulously preserved. She uploaded them into a secure folder and wrote a formal rebuttal. 6 pages, referenced, time-stamped, with a digital log of every modification. Then she sent it directly to the committee. CC'd the dean, CC'd Mercer. Then she shut her laptop and lay back on the bed, eyes open in the dark. This wasn't about science anymore. It was about territory. Over the next week, the whispers grew louder. Someone leaked the inquiry to a campus blog. Elena Marquez, under investigation for academic misconduct, the headline read. It spread like wildfire. The support she'd gained started to fracture. A few classmates stopped saying, "Hello, study partners," cancelled meetings. Even professors became strangely formal in tone. She walked the halls like a ghost in her own life. Even brilliance, she realized, wasn't immune to suspicion, especially not when it came in the form of a young Filipina woman without legacy or donations behind her name. Then came the message that changed everything. A soft ping from her inbox, an unfamiliar address. Subject, "They've tried this before." The message was brief. "Don't panic. This isn't the first time Mercer's tried to silence a student. He did the same thing to Dr. L.K. In 2009, I have documentation. Meet me 10 p.m. Engineering library basement. Come alone." There was no signature, no sender, just a digital ghost. She almost didn't go, but curiosity outweighed caution. She slipped out after dark, hoodie up, backpack slung low, and made her way to the engineering building. It was deserted, echoey, cold. Down in the basement, the lights buzzed faintly overhead. And then, from the far corner of the archives, someone stepped into view. A woman, early 40s, short-cropped hair, glasses, a badge clipped to her blazer. "You're Elena," she said. Elena nodded slowly. "You wrote the message?" The woman held up a file. Inside were emails, transcripts, and a copy of an old withdrawal form. "Dr. Lucia Kim," she said quietly. "Mercer destroyed her career before it began. Same method. Accusation of plagiarism, vague ethics charges, enough to force her out." She was 22. Eleanor opened the folder. The story was disturbingly familiar. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because I was her roommate," the woman replied, "and I didn't speak up then." She handed Eleanor a flash drive. "Don't let history repeat itself." By the following morning, Eleanor had everything she needed. She compiled the files, referenced the former student's case, and tied the patterns together. Then she sent it, not to the university committee, but to the press, and to MIT, and to Dr. Sabin Kohler. Within 48 hours, the tables had turned again. A university-wide review was announced. Dr. Mercer was placed on temporary suspension, pending investigation. His name, once sacred in Halban's halls, became an asterisk in faculty meetings. Elena? She walked to class with her head high, not in arrogance, but in knowing. She had fought back, not with bitterness, not with revenge, but with truth. And that, she realized, was what scared them most. Eleanor had walked into Halbin's gates as a whisper. Now she echoed through every corner. The inquiry into Dr. Vincent Mercer wasn't just a faculty matter anymore. It had sparked something deeper, an overdue reckoning. The walls of academia, once fortified by tradition and silence, were beginning to shift under the pressure of truth. And Eleanor, she became the symbol of it. 2 weeks after the story broke, Halbin University convened an emergency faculty integrity review. The administration tried to downplay it, calling it a routine reassessment of internal procedures, but everyone knew the truth. Elena watched from the back of the auditorium as the first hearing began. The room was filled with grey suits and furrowed brows. A panel of tenured professors sat behind a long mahogany table, their expressions unreadable. At the center, Dr. Mercer sat stiffly, his hands folded tightly over a yellow legal pad. He looked smaller now. Gone was the man who had once towered over students with intellectual menace. He looked like a relic of a system that had finally been challenged publicly, relentlessly, and without apology. Miss Marquez, can you explain how you came into possession of the evidence related to Dr. Lucia Kim's departure? Elena stood at the lectern, steady and poised. An anonymous source reached out to me after the inquiry into my own conduct began. They provided documentation suggesting a pattern of academic retaliation. The chairwoman of the panel nodded. And did you verify the authenticity of the files before going public? Yes, Elena replied. I cross-checked them with digital timestamps, university records, and published timelines, everything aligned. The details matched faculty calendars, class logs, even email headers. Were you aware that going to the press might endanger your standing here? Eleanor didn't blink. I was more concerned about the students who might suffer in silence after me. There was a pause in the room. Then, a faculty member, on the far end, the oldest of the group, Dr. Miriam Keats, cleared her throat. She had taught at Halbin for nearly 4 decades. Her voice was brittle, but commanding. When I was Elena's age, she said softly, we were taught to survive in academia by staying invisible, especially women of color. But I see now, invisibility has never been a path to justice. She looked down at her notes. Miss Marquez, thank you. Outside the chamber, the student body buzzed with a new kind of energy. Debates flared, not just about science, but about power, equity, and gatekeeping. Lecture halls filled up with students eager to question, not just absorb, and in dorm rooms and cafes, the once dismissed voices of first-generation scholars and scholarship kids began to rise. Halbin had been an ivory tower, but now someone had cracked its foundation. That night, Eleanor sat in the dim glow of her dorm room, her laptop open, fingers tapping across the keyboard. She wasn't writing another rebuttal. She was drafting a proposal. Halbin Transparency Initiative. A student-led project to demand academic accountability, create anonymous reporting channels, and require inclusive training for faculty on unconscious bias, particularly in competitive STEM programs. She hit send on the draft and forwarded it to the Student Union and the Office of Equity and Inclusion. Within an hour, her inbox lit up. 10 students volunteered to help. By morning, there were 30. A week later, the proposal reached the desk of Dr. Lorraine Adler, the Vice President of Academic Affairs. She was known to be fair but cautious. She summoned Eleanor to her office, a space filled with floor-to-ceiling books and the scent of old parchment. A silent metronome ticked on the bookshelf, echoing every passing second like a heartbeat. Eleanor, she began, gesturing to a leather chair, your proposal has merit, but do you understand the implications of what you're asking for? Yes, Eleanor said without hesitation. Because I've lived them. Adler studied her for a moment, then leaned back, exhaling. There are members of this institution who won't appreciate what you're doing. Change threatens comfort. Eleanor nodded. I'm not doing this for comfort. I'm doing it so that the next Kalista, or Lucia Kim, doesn't have to fight this hard just to be heard. Adler tapped a finger on the folder. Then I'll support you, she said. But be prepared. This isn't just a proposal. It's a revolution. Quiet ones can be the most dangerous. And so it began. Eleanor became more than a student. She became an organizer. Workshops were scheduled, anonymous forums launched, faculty were invited, some reluctantly, to attend peer accountability sessions. One department even began re-evaluating their grading policies, prompted by a viral student story about biased oral exams. The administration, under mounting pressure, released a statement acknowledging past failures and pledging to do better. It was vague, but it was a start. One afternoon, as Eleanor crossed the central quad, a young freshman ran up to her, wide-eyed, clutching a notebook. "Are you Eleanor Marquez?" She smiled. "Yes. I'm here because of you. I applied to Halburn after I read what you did. My mom said, you go where the brave ones are. So I came." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Hope. Not loud, but undeniable. She reached out and took the girl's hand. Then make it count. By the end of the semester, Halburn was different. Not fixed, not perfect, but different. More eyes were open, more voices were speaking. And Eleanor? She had done more than dismantle a man's ego. She had built something. Something lasting. Something brave. Elena Marquez stood at the edge of the campus courtyard as golden autumn leaves fell gently around her. The towering columns of Halburn's oldest lecture hall loomed behind her like guardians of an era slowly giving way. The semester had ended, but the movement had only just begun. She breathed in deeply. For the first time in her life, her breath didn't feel borrowed. It felt earned. The Halburn Transparency Initiative had taken root beyond anyone's expectations. 6 departments had adopted blind grading methods. The university board had authorized an annual equity audit, and Dr. Vincent Mercer, he had officially resigned. His exit came in a quiet internal memo, buried in administrative jargon, but everyone knew the storm he stirred had revealed more than personal cruelty. It had revealed a culture long overdue for confrontation. The statement was simple. Effective immediately, Dr. Mercer will be taking an indefinite leave of absence to pursue independent research. But the halls whispered the real story. And Eleanor. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply moved forward. A week later, she received a call. A woman's voice, firm but kind, came through the line. "Elena Marquez." "Yes," she answered, cautiously. "My name is Dr. Lorraine Bennett. I'm a program director at the Thayer Institute in Washington. We've followed your work at Halburn, and we'd like to invite you to speak at our winter symposium on systemic bias in higher education." Eleanor blinked. "Me?" "Yes. You've done something few others have instigated change from within quietly, effectively, and with integrity." 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood backstage at the Thayer Institute, clutching her speech in shaking hands. The room beyond was filled with scholars, deans, activists, and students. She wasn't just addressing a classroom anymore, she was addressing the people who shaped the national conversation around academia. But instead of panic, she felt peace. Because the story she would tell wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to sit down when they should have stood, to stay quiet when they knew the truth. When she stepped up to the podium, the light above her was blinding, but her voice, steady. "I wasn't supposed to be seen," she began. "I was supposed to sit in the back of the room, take good notes, and never challenge authority, especially not in physics. Especially not as a brown girl with a last name too many professors mispronounced." She paused. "And yet, here I am." The crowd leaned in. "My name is Elena Marquez. I'm a Filipina-American physics student, and this is not a story of triumph over adversity. It's a story about systems. Systems that reward cruelty as rigor, that mistake intimidation for brilliance, and what happens when someone refuses to be quiet." She spoke of Dr. Mercer, of humiliation disguised as high standards, of the fear that froze the lecture hall, and the fire that finally broke through it. But she didn't stop there. She talked about Kalista Ramos, the classmate who came forward first, about Dr. Lucia Kim, the faculty member whose story had been buried, about the hundreds of students who sent her letters after the story broke, sharing their own scars, their own silence. And she ended with a challenge. "We don't need another policy. We need a culture that protects inquiry without punishing identity, that celebrates genius without demanding it come in one form. And above all, we need to stop mistaking quiet students for compliant ones. Sometimes, silence is the space before a revolution." The room erupted in a standing ovation, but Eleanor didn't bask in it. She bowed her head gently, walked off the stage, and called her mother. "Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I did it. I told our story." Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then, she simply said, "I'm proud of you, Anik, not for speaking, but for knowing when it mattered most." Spring came early that year. Elena's last semester at Halban was filled with unexpected lightness. Not because the challenges were gone, but because the weight wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. More students joined the Transparency Initiative. Faculty started requesting student feedback sessions, and the student union elected its first female president of color in 15 years. It wasn't a perfect place, but it was changing. And Eleanor? She began mentoring. Not officially. Just quiet conversations in libraries, in empty classrooms after hours, in cafes off campus. Younger students came to her with trembling voices asking, "How did you know when to speak?" And she'd always say the same thing. "You'll know." It's the moment your truth becomes louder than your fear. On graduation day, Eleanor walked across the stage to polite applause, but in the crowd, a few students stood up, not for show, but for recognition. They held small signs. "You helped me stay. You made me believe I could." "Thank you, Eleanor." Tears welled up, but she held her gaze steady as she accepted her degree. Dean Harold Montgomery handed it to her with both hands. "Miss Marquez," he said, voice low, "this university will never forget you." "I hope it remembers what I stood for," she replied. And then she stepped down, not into an ending, but into everything ahead. That summer, Eleanor moved to Boston to begin her graduate fellowship. Her name no longer whispered, her voice no longer hidden. And though she'd never sought fame, invitations began pouring in. keynote requests, panel seats, interview spots. She accepted some, declined most, because she had a different focus. She was building a platform one dedicated to supporting students from marginalized backgrounds entering competitive STEM programs. Not a flashy startup, not a viral campaign, just space. Space to be brilliant without apology. One evening, she received an email from Dr. Lorraine Adler. Subject: "You'll want to see this." Attached was a memo. Faculty Senate passes mandatory mentorship training focused on unconscious bias proposal by Elena Marquez officially adopted. She smiled, her eyes misting. It wasn't about a name in a headline. It was about something lasting. Elena Marquez had walked into Halburn alone. She left as something more. Not just a student, not just a survivor, but as a new kind of scholar. The kind who rewrote the rules. The kind who didn't raise her voice to be heard, she raised the standard, and that, in the end, was the voice that stayed. The story of Elena Marquez reminds us of something many of us forget with time, that quiet courage often speaks the loudest. In a world where louder voices seem to win, Elena showed that truth and wisdom don't need to shout to make an impact. For older Americans who have lived through decades of change, her story resonates deeply. It reminds us that age, experience, and perspective come with the responsibility to listen, to see potential where others might overlook it. Elena didn't fight with anger. She stood firm with knowledge, grace, and conviction. That's a lesson for all of us. The power to stand for what's right doesn't fade with age, it grows. Whether in our communities, our families, or within ourselves, we still have the ability to encourage truth, challenge injustice, and support the next generation to shine on their own terms. The world doesn't need more noise, it needs more wisdom. And that's something we all carry, especially as we grow older.